They are all income tax exempt. Is that governments giving away resources that produce outcomes that are not human rights compliant? We know that real estate investment trusts are part of this rise in the cost of rents. Giving them a tax break to raise rents in a human rights world wouldn't be allowed. Human rights are actually way more practical than people think because it provides you with this sort of guidance of, I need to achieve this outcome, safe, secure, affordable, sustainable housing. Does this tax policy create that? No, that tax incentive is creating higher rents.
Every day in cities, towns, and villages around the world, people struggle to meet their basic needs. They don't have access to clean drinking water or sufficient food to feed themselves and their families. Hundreds of millions find it challenging just to put a roof over their heads. Their interminable preoccupation? Housing. I'm Adrian Harewood, and this is In Bed with the Elephant. According to the United Nations, more than 1.8 billion people around the globe lack adequate housing. In the places they call home, they've been priced out of the market. They can't afford to pay the rent and have given up on ever owning a home. Indeed, for many, the places that should be sanctuaries are unlivable, nightmarish spaces. Leilani Farha spends much of her time thinking about ways to make housing more accessible and affordable for people everywhere. She's a Canadian lawyer and human rights activist who for 6 years, between 2014 and 2020, was the United Nations Special Rapporteur on adequate housing. In 2019, she was a subject of an award-winning documentary called Push about the unaffordability of housing worldwide and the impacts of financialization on housing security. Leilani Farha is currently the global director of The Shift, a human rights organization focusing on housing, finance, and climate. Leilani, welcome to In Bed with the Elephant.
Thank you so much, Adrian. It's lovely to be here.
It's great to see you. And full disclosure, I have known you since I was about 8 years old.
Correct.
We went to elementary school together.
We did.
And we we thought highly of you. Thanks for being here. I wanted to begin this way because you think that housing is the biggest issue that human beings face. Why is that?
I've come to realize over many years, and it's taken many years, that housing is everything to people. So much is rooted in home. And it's not to say that everyone gets to stay home. A lot of people have to leave home for a variety of reasons, political, conflict reasons, economic reasons. But wherever people go, they try to make home. They long for home. There's something incredibly deep about home and our connection to the planet, I think. And so I really think home is everything. And so when it's not stable, when it's disrupted, when it's precarious, then it really is the single biggest problem.
More than climate change? More than food?
People say of climate change, it's this existential threat. Housing is an immediate, direct, felt threat. Food and housing go hand in hand, of course. But what I have found in my experiences is that people will forego food to pay the rent.
It's the safety, it's the security.
Absolutely. I mean, I don't want to paint too rosy a picture of home. A lot of people suffer in their homes. There's violence in homes. I also want to say, Adrian, things don't have to compete. Home can be essential to human beings, and a healthy planet can be too at the same time. And in fact, they're actually connected.
And the planet is our home.
Correct.
The planet is our house.
And if you read anything by Indigenous peoples from this country talking about land and territory, they always talk about home. They don't have this sort of like four walls and a roof concept of home. It's much more expansive than that. And I think that's probably true of Indigenous peoples worldwide.
Tell us about the relationship or the connection between climate justice and housing.
Yeah, there's a tight connection between the two. And it happens on both sides. So housing itself is a huge contributor to greenhouse gas emissions, more than people think. And it is both the operational side of housing. So do you have drafty windows, and how energy efficient is your home, right? But it's also the construction of housing. All of the transportation and all of the construction around, using cement versus timber, et cetera, all of that has to be considered in terms of the greenhouse gas emissions. Not all governments actually measure both, but it's well understood now that about between 30 and 40% of greenhouse gas emissions comes from housing. But then there's the other side too, which is the people who contribute the least in terms of behaviors to climate change suffer the most. So who's on the front line of a climate-related disaster, for example? People living in homelessness, right? Fires, floods, hurricanes, tornadoes, all of that stuff. Obviously, if you're living in a tent, you are going to be most impacted. But if you're living in a tent, you are creating the least amount of greenhouse gas emissions, right? So the injustice there is real. I think less attention is paid to the people who are suffering the effects of climate change.
When it comes to housing security, are there any jurisdictions in the world that are getting it right?
There are pockets. If I look at Finland as a country, if I look at Copenhagen as a city within Denmark, I see some cool things happening. Singapore is doing some interesting things to try to keep people secure. So in Finland, they're actually addressing homelessness.
How?
They use what's called a housing first and human rights approach. They believe that everyone has the fundamental right to housing. That's the basis upon which they base their housing first approach. And housing first is basically make sure people who are homeless have a home, provide them with services if they need services and supports. And from there, they will be able to live autonomously eventually, hopefully. They also look at things like, do people have sufficient income? Why are people falling into homelessness? And try to take preventative measures. Copenhagen, they've been pretty proactive on the financialization of housing, so really trying to push back the big financial actors from invading the city and taking over housing and making rents unaffordable, and putting in legislation that protects tenants. So sort of twofold, pushing back against the private equity firms, for example, but also ensuring better protections for tenants. So there's little pockets. Singapore really tries to curb this housing speculation, for example, by putting whopping taxes on second, third, fourth home ownership, for example. So I can see these things, but what I feel is really missing is a state that is doing that big step back, that reset. Let's make sure that all of our housing and finance and climate-related policies create human rights outcomes.
Mm-hmm. And your argument is that if those social protections are provided, everyone lives better.
Absolutely. I mean, that's one of the things I love about human rights, too, is it should make people happier, and therefore cities should be better, happier, more joyful places, right? We would have fewer protests, right? You wouldn't have rent strikes outside of buildings, less labor strikes of workers.
And so the reason it doesn't happen is because we're committed to inequality.
You could say that. I think there is a real drive toward wealth and uber wealth at all costs, and the cost is people and well-being and human rights.
Why is housing a human right?
Because it's so fundamental to human dignity and to life itself. It's that simple. How do you have human dignity if you're living on a sidewalk? I mean, people struggle and they will cling to their dignity. I've met many people on sidewalks in countries around the world, and they cling to their dignity. It's amazing. And we know that without housing, your life expectancy drops dramatically to half, right? Half of what a housed person's life expectancy will be. So it's those connections that make it a human right, because human rights is about preserving life and human dignity.
So what does it mean that housing is a human right? And when I ask that question, I'm talking about the state. What kind of obligations does the state have, given the fact that housing is a human right, as you put it?
So nice that you would acknowledge states have obligations with respect to a human right. We're at a time when states seem to be turning away from obligations with respect to human rights. With respect to housing, it does appear in many international human rights treaties that states have signed and ratified, including the government of Canada, for example. More than 160 states have signed and ratified a treaty that includes the right to housing, and they do have very distinct obligations. They have to respect, protect, fulfill and promote the right to housing. In particular, it means acknowledging and taking seriously that housing is a human right. They should legislate that right, put it in legislation, not necessarily constitution, but that'd be great too, constitutional protections. But it also means spending money in certain ways, spending monies in ways that don't undermine the right, but that actually promote and enhance that right. It means enacting legislations that would protect tenants, for example. It means ensuring that conditions like homelessness are addressed on an urgent and priority basis because it's such an egregious violation of the right to housing. So there's lots of obligations for governments, but they're all very simple and very straightforward.
What are the implications then for the folks that build the houses, for the developers, private equity firms that are building these homes?
There's two ways we can look at that. Let's just take straightforward private equity, pension funds, investing in housing. They have what are called human rights responsibilities. So that's a little bit different than an obligation because private actors don't ratify international law the way governments do. So they have responsibilities. Those responsibilities are to do no harm and to promote the right to housing. So they should be looking at their business models and asking themselves, does this business model undermine the right to housing? For example, if I invest in this building and my business model is such that I need to raise rents in order to pay back my loan and to make a profit off of this building, am I running afoul of the human right to housing? Am I going to make this housing unaffordable for the people living there, which would be in contravention of the right? Now, I hope the listeners are laughing because find me a developer, a private equity investor, an asset management firm that is doing that analysis of their business plans. Are they ensuring they're doing no harm? Are they ensuring that their business model is actually promoting affordable, secure housing? We know that that's not the case, right? We see renovictions, people call them, where a buyer acquires a property and in order to make a profit off of that property, they need to do upgrades, and I'll put that in air quotes, and those upgrades then mean evicting tenants, raising rents, making it difficult for previous tenants to remain tenants at these new higher level of rents. The other track, which is kind of less talked about in a way, is that in most Western societies, governments have embraced a kind of neoliberal approach to housing in particular.
What does that mean when you say neoliberal?
That means governments have taken a step back themselves from engaging in housing and they handed it over to the private sector. They said, hey,
to the market.
We're not going to build social housing. We're not going to be involved in affordable housing. We're just going to let the market what markets will do and trickle down theory. It'll all work out in the end.
And also a lack of regulation as well. That's also an implication.
A lack of regulation. The idea is the more public monies you throw at them and tax breaks and tax advantages that you give them, the more likely it is that this will all trickle down. That was the theory, which has, of course, been debunked. What happened then was when they handed over housing to the market, they didn't hand over the human rights obligations that governments themselves had.
You have a problem with the way in which housing is viewed or regarded in this society, that it's seen as a commodity, that it's seen as an investment. What's wrong with that? There are a lot of folks who are looking forward to eventually, using their housing to pay for their retirement. This is their nest egg that they're going to use to allow their children perhaps to attend post-secondary institution. What's wrong with the idea of a house, your house, being a commodity?
So I'm going to split hairs. I think I have a problem with housing and its assetization, where it's viewed as an asset. And there is a difference between a commodity and an asset. When you treat housing as an asset, it becomes a vehicle of finance. When you treat it as a commodity, you might say like a mortgage is a commodity. While I have some issues with the way mortgaging is happening now, I'm not trying to debunk a mortgage-based housing system per se. What I'm more concerned about right now is the assetization of housing, where You trade it on stock markets where you use it to leverage more capital, where you use it to hide capital, park capital, launder capital, etc. That, to me, is what is causing so much of our housing crisis now. It's not to say there isn't stuff going on in the mortgage lending area. There is. But it's the idea that housing is really simply a tool. It has nothing to do with people, home, all the stuff we talked about at the top, dignity, respect, keeping people safe. It's about how do I leverage more money so I can make more profit, for example. I mean, that's what a developer is doing, or an asset manager or a private equity firm or a pension fund. They're looking to see how they can make profit. We're talking uber profit here. We're not talking about like the person whose home increases in value over 30 years, right, and the equity they build. We're talking in a 5 to 10 year period how they can make double-digit returns on their investment.
So you think then that the affordability crisis in housing that is a problem certainly in Canada, it's a problem in North America, it's a problem really around the world. Ordinary people in cities, towns around the world are struggling to afford places to live in their homes, in their home territories. You blame financialization for the affordability crisis, but the National Post, in an article that was written in March, said this: in the past year, multiple federal and provincial politicians finally recognized one important reason why Canada's housing shortage in the last decade became severe. Rents soared and home prices stayed at nosebleed levels, unsustainably high immigration rates, which recent minor reductions have barely begun to address. Your critics would say the problem in Canada, the reason for the affordability crisis, is immigration.
Yes, they would, and they would be racist.
Are they wrong?
Where the governments have failed is recognizing that they needed a housing policy to match that. If they're using housing to drive the economy, to satisfy investor interests, they lost sight of the real role and purpose of housing, which is to house people, especially people who are moving from other countries and will be looking for a place to live. So that's the problem, in my mind. It has nothing to do with immigrants.
What kind of housing policy does the country need in order to ensure that people can afford the abodes they live in?
I actually think, and this is a tall order, but I think we do need a complete reset, a housing policy reset. We need governments to take a big step back. And I keep saying governments because, of course, in this country, there has to be cooperation between the national level government and provincial government and municipal governments. But I think we need to take a big step back and say, okay, what would housing policy look like if we tried to achieve human rights outcomes? If we tried to ensure we eradicated homelessness, if we tried to ensure that housing was affordable to households based on household income, and if we tried to ensure that we were building sustainably so we don't contribute to climate change, also an important human right, what would that policy look like? And I think starting fresh that way might lead us to very different answers than where we've gone now.
So flesh that out for us. Flesh out that human rights economy.
It's outcome driven, right? So first of all, homelessness under human rights law is considered a prima facie violation of the right to housing. In other words, no matter which way you slice it, no matter how you look at homelessness, it's a violation. Because of that, it has to be dealt with on an urgent and priority basis. So if you're government and you're sitting back and you're going, okay, I'm doing a housing policy reset and I'm going to have human rights outcomes, well, then you're going to tackle homelessness first. You're not going to say, homeless people don't vote, or they vote less. A lot of them are refugees, so they can't vote, right? Which is, I think, part of the calculation that happens now. Or, my constituents don't like homeless people because there's so much discrimination against homeless people. Politicians are always calculating, I'm not going to win favors by addressing homelessness, right? So that would all be scrapped. And the starting point would be, homeless people need a life of dignity. What are we going to do? The second thing is there's this notion that governments have to spend in the human rights world the maximum of their resources to address human rights violations. In this case, to address homelessness, unaffordable housing, etc. Well, that forces governments then to look at how are they taxing different entities engaged in the housing sector. If you take real estate investment trusts, they are big investors in housing in this country, Canada, but around the world. 43 jurisdictions around the world have real estate investment trusts. And they all have the same legislative framework, no matter where you go. They are all income tax exempt. Is that governments giving away resources that produce outcomes that are not human rights compliant? We know that real estate investment trusts are part of this rise in the cost of rents. Giving them a tax break to raise rents in a human rights world wouldn't be allowed. Human rights are actually way more practical than people think because it provides you with this sort of guidance of, I need to achieve this outcome, safe, secure, affordable, sustainable housing. Does this tax policy create that? No, that tax incentive is creating higher rents.
You think that following a human rights agenda is the way to deal with a lot of the seemingly intractable problems that we face as a world community?
I think so. What I love about human rights is it's actually not that prescriptive. It's framework, and it's about accountability. And that's its strength. So I can apply the human right to housing here in Ottawa, Canada, and I can apply it in Mumbai. It's going to look slightly different based on context, but the framework is going to be the same. That's the power. At the end of the day, if you want to understand what human rights is about, it should be about accountability. Establishing mechanisms for governments to hold themselves accountable and to be held accountable.
There seems to be an assault around the world on the human rights idea, the human rights project. We see a lot of human rights institutions which are painted, I suppose, as villainous. We see, for example, the ICC prosecutor who has himself now been transformed into almost a criminal, for wanting to ensure that human rights are being respected. What's going on when it comes to the kind of world community's relationship with this idea of human rights?
So I think about a year ago, I might have said, oh my gosh, the Human Rights Project is under assault. This is what happens when human rights are not implemented and impunity for violations is allowed. And I think today, I think slightly differently. I think, perhaps this international system is functioning exactly how it was set up to function.
So it wasn't made for the global south. That you're saying that this is a system that was built for the West, for northern countries?
It seems so. The elephant in the room is Palestine. And it does seem that Palestine is the litmus test for the international system. And it seems clear that the international system absolutely wasn't established to protect Palestinians. 60,000 deaths later.
Ambulances being bombed, schools being bombed.
People being starved. On and
people
on.
being evacuated, sent to shelters, and then those shelters being bombed.
Mm-hmm. Tortured, imprisoned, disappeared, buried under rubble. But I have heard from Zionists in particular that there is a sense that things like the ICC and things like recourse for violations of international law were never intended to apply to Palestinians. The idea of genocide was never meant to attach to a people's like the Palestinians or the Palestinians in particular.
The argument, though, is that there's a war going on and that Israel is firing at these edifices, these hospitals, because there are terrorists who are embedded there. That these ambulances are not really ambulances. They are vehicles that are transporting guns. Or these schools are not really schools. These are veritable bunkers that members of Hamas are using in order to prosecute assaults on the IDF, on the Israeli army. How do you respond to that counter?
Well, there are rules in conflict. Human rights and humanitarian law governs conflict. And even if there is a suspected Hamas militant in one of these buildings, you cannot obliterate children, civilians, etc., to get to that one target. Those are the rules. These are civilian infrastructure. You can't do it. Those are the rules. And Israel has made it clear that they perceive every Palestinian in Gaza to be of Hamas. And so there's your answer.
Well, their argument is that Hamas represents, and the Palestinian represents, an existential threat, and that Hamas has declared that it wants to erase Israel from the map, or at least it wants to extirpate Jews from Israel, and that Israel has a right to defend itself.
And they are shooting babies in the head and in the heart. That's the existential threat. That infant is the existential threat. It is not true that Israel has the right to defend itself in international law. It is an occupier, and it has to protect the occupied. That's what humanitarian law says, actually, the Fourth Geneva Convention. They are responsible for the well-being of that population. And so it's not to suggest that if Hamas kills civilian Israelis, that should be commended or accepted. That's a war crime too. The death of any innocent civilian, any civilian, is a war crime, period.
As someone who spent years traveling around the world, concerned about the state of housing on every continent, what goes through your mind when you see some of those pictures? The fact that so many houses have been demolished. One wonders what happens to those people who don't have a roof. What are they doing from day to day? What's been kind of going through your mind?
What Palestinians in Gaza have seen and experienced, those who are survivors, is unfathomable. Probably there isn't a single Palestinian in Gaza who is unscathed, not a single person. So that's what goes through my mind, is despair for what they're experiencing now and for their futures. When you're attacking homes and obliterating home, you are obliterating a peoples when you do that. I have been working on a project that's in Gaza, and it is about home and recovery and reconstruction. These are words that are meaningless in the moment. But when the ceasefire happened, all the surviving Palestinians, what did they do? They trekked back home. The power of home, the draw of home. Many of them knew that what they would encounter could be rubble and not an intact home, but they went anyway.
Some people are going to say, why? Why would you go back home to that? We hear Donald Trump saying that people either need to be moved or the whole thing needs to be cleaned up and started anew. Just getting back to that, why would people be drawn to rubble?
It's their land. The documentary that came out, it was about an area in the West Bank, but no other land. They have no other land. That is who they are. They are of the land, just like Indigenous peoples around the world. And so that drive to go home, I cannot imagine the calculations that Palestinians in Gaza are making, trying to figure out how to survive in what are unsurvivable conditions. The thing is about Donald Trump, he's like, well, why would they want to stay there? It seems the wrong question. Why would Palestinians in Gaza stay? The right question is, what can we do to ensure Palestinians in Gaza can stay on their land?
What do you see as being the future of the human rights project? When you kind of imagine this world of ours 10, 15, 20 years from now, what do you see?
Yeah, so I'm not there. I have no idea. I don't know how to be right now. I don't know how to be a human rights lawyer. I don't know how to be me in all of this. And so it's too difficult for me to imagine where human rights is going and where it will go. I feel like none of the right conversations are even happening. And
I'm curious, is the skepticism that you have now, is this something that's new? Because some might say, Leilani Farha, you're kind of exposing yourself in some ways, being rather somewhat naive. That, didn't you realize that these institutions have always served the interests of power, have always served the interests of the empire? Why has it taken you so long to realize something that we always saw?
So I was a human rights mechanism myself. I was a UN Special Rapporteur. And so obviously I had some belief in the system. I also, of course, was upfront and close with the system and knew its frailties, its weaknesses, how it supported empire. I'm not afraid to admit that because There is something really beautiful about the idea of universal human rights. To me, I'm not someone who engages in conversations around hope. Oh, I hope this, I hope that. I am someone who really believes in possibility. And I think human rights at some point in my life offered possibility. And I did see some changes through using the human rights framework. Some effective things have happened. And that's that, oh, okay, possibility. This conversation about the financialization of housing, when I started it from a human rights side, was in 2017. No one was talking about it as a human rights issue. No one. I mean, there were like a handful of us. And now look at it. I mean, we're having podcasts about it. And so I saw in human rights possibility. I wasn't totally naive.
You're the global director, though, of a human rights organization. Is the work that you're doing futile?
Possibly. Who knows? I do take inspiration from Indigenous peoples who have been in such a long, long struggle, including Palestinians. And I remember in the film No Other Land,
the Oscar-winning
documentary, I remember the Israeli journalist Yuval. They're in the car and Yuval really wants change, and he's like expecting there to be change overnight. And Basil says to him, like, looks over at him and like, calm down, man. Like, it's not going to happen overnight. As much as we may all want it to happen overnight, it's not going to happen overnight. And so that makes me feel a little bit better about the things I'm pursuing through the shift. Maybe we can chip away. Maybe we can say some true things and open some eyes and change behavior. But what's the alternative? I could wake up in the morning and do nothing. I suppose that's an alternative, and try to live with myself. I'm not constellated that way. I do think I'm changing what I think, where I should put my energy. I think advocacy, like we talked about the Human Rights Project maybe being dead. I think advocacy, as I knew it, might be a little bit dead. And maybe we need to think of new ways of doing advocacy. And for me, at this stage in my life, I'm thinking maybe I need to spend more time reflecting, writing, and putting big ideas out there in a different way rather than knocking on government door.
Leilani Farha, thanks so much.
It's a pleasure, Adrian.
You've been listening to In Bed with the Elephant on Ricochet Media. Producer and sound engineer, Dave Sarrazin. Executive producers, Ethan Cox and Andrea Houston. Music by Parker Harewood. Graphics, Connor Killoran. I'm Adrian Harewood. I'll talk to you next time.